Hello everyone, David here, MixWest TV. Hope you're having a great day. With me today, someone that you've seen before on the channel. You guys always like when he's here with us, Joe Vezzetti. Thank you for being
here.
Good
afternoon.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Awesome, awesome. If you don't remember, guys, we saw him tweaking my 5500 API EQ, which is right there, at his amazing studio. Please talk about the studio a little bit.
Sure, no problem. I work at Cherokee Recording Studios in the heart of Hollywood. We have a nice 40-year history in the recording business with Los Angeles. And we are currently located on 5241 Melrose.
All right, and it's awesome. We also had a studio tour here on the channel. So if you want to see Joe's studio, check the videos that are here on the channel. But Joe is an amazing designer, gear, former Avalon. Can we say that?
You can say it. Well, I was the head of service for Avalon. I didn't design any of the Avalon stuff.
Okay. But you do design your own gear, right?
I am working on stuff currently, yes.
All right, and we'll see something in the future?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
And, I do tweak things as well for people and off and on and so forth. Which is part why I'm here today.
Yep. Exactly.
We were fixing a switch on...
We were fixing a switch on one of the units that, it happened, the light went off and we had to replace it.
Well, we replaced the light and so forth.
And also what we are here today is because I want you to talk to my audience about the 120 volts technology that recently I got this SPL mastering EQ, and their mastering gear is known for having this 120 volts technology. Okay?
Right, correct.
So let's assume I absolutely don't know anything about anything, and like you explain why this 120 technology. First of all, why are they the only one doing it, and what does it mean in terms of performance?
Okay.
A unit that has 120 volts technology. First of all, 120 volt technology against instead of what? What's the normal?
Okay, well, let's start off with when we first were using tube equipment.
Yeah.
In order to operate tube equipment, you had a couple of different voltage supplies that would feed the tubes.
Right.
And you had, for example, 6 or 12 volts on average. Was the average for most tubes. And it would heat the tube up, which allowed electricity to flow. And then you would have your plate voltages, which is where all the audio came from. And plate voltages were 300 volts on average.
Okay.
Depending on the piece of equipment, like microphones are around 120 to 200, depending on the microphone and so forth. And it basically equated to distortions and headrooms.
Okay, so
and how much headroom you have before you have distortion.
Right.
That was the big component with it. And the thing with tubes is they're always in constant distortion mode.
Okay.
So by the time you actually hear distortion, it's something musical that you like and something you're used to.
Right.
So we went from tubes to solid state with transistors and discrete transistor circuitry before we designed the IC chips and so forth. And when we were doing the discrete transistor technology, a lot of it was done with asymmetrical power supplies, which basically means it's a single voltage.
Okay.
So your old Neve equipment and your old Neve clones are running off 24 volts.
Okay.
And what that does is it changes where your headroom's at, it changes where your distortions are at, it changes how your distortions sound.
Okay.
So by the time you go into distortion land, it sounds a little different. It's no longer the second harmonic that you get with tubes. You're running into that third harmonic distortion.
Okay.
And so forth. So by the time you notice it, it's like, well, wait a minute. That's way different.
Yeah.
Rupert in particular, rest in peace, was smart in picking the right components that when it does distort, it sounds musical. Transformers he picked that went along with his equipment, which is why something like a 1073 has 9 points in the signal path from input to output, where you can drive it into distortion.
Okay.
And it just sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And it's that sound that we're like, that's great. You know it's Neve. It's that rock and roll sound.
Yeah, it is.
So as we further advanced in discrete technologies, we started with things like API, where they came out with a discrete op amp that no longer ran on an asymmetrical supply. They ran on what they call a bipolar supply.
Okay.
So instead of it being 0 volts and 24 volts this way, they said, we're going to do 15 volts this way and 15 volts below the 0 line.
Okay.
So we now have a 30 volt signal instead of 24 volts.
Okay.
Which gives you a little more headroom.
Oh.
Not as much headroom as an SSL, where you have plus minus 18 volts, which is a 36 volt signal.
Okay.
You know, so we're increasing our headroom size and how much headroom we have before we run into overloading our circuit and so forth.
Is this for consoles and gear?
This is in general. So as you increase your voltages, you increase the ability to have more headroom.
Right.
So pretty much the current standard right now for most consoles is plus minus 18 volts.
So SSL.
Like SSL and the current Neve productions.
Were they
not
the
Rupert
first?
Neve, but AMS Neve.
Okay, AMS Neve.
The reason we're doing that is because they're using specific IC chips that's the max that they can run.
Okay.
Before they crap out in distortion and so forth. So it's a good compromise.
Yeah.
And we've gotten used to working that way. You know, and when we run into distortion, we kind of just lower the volume down a bit on an SSL because as much as we like SSLs, sometimes when they distort, it's not as
too much and it's
musical sounding as we like. And where we started with this stuff is probably in the early 70s when we started using IC chips like the 741.
Okay.
Which was the very first IC chip designed, an audio op-amp.
Okay.
It was very horrible. The specs on it are pretty bad. There are guys like John Klett, who's an amazing tech in his own right, and he will tell you that you can do some good things with the 741, but he's in the minority.
Okay.
And I'm not going to say anything bad about that. He knows what he's doing when he uses them.
Yeah.
And I've heard his mic pre's that he makes with them, and they're amazing in their own right. So it's like, well, is it really the part, or is it the fact that he knows what to do with them?
Yeah, exactly.
And the reality is, if you know what to do with the parts you're using, you can make some amazing stuff.
All right. Yeah, makes sense.
Other custom, smaller companies doing consoles like Rupert Neve Designs are running completely different. They have, if I remember correctly, plus minus 45.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, when we put the 5088 in at the Harmony Hut for a bit, I think it was a plus minus 45, which gives you a lot of headroom.
Yeah.
You know, and you can drive it harder and harder and harder before it starts to crap out.
I have two Neve tape emulator there, the 542.
So that's a little different. The fact that it's in an API rack, which the API racks run off their own, you know, setup. And if you want to be API compliant, it's a plus minus 15 volts. Okay. Plus minus 16 volts, depending on the rack and depending on the year it was made.
Okay. Okay.
Which seems to be good enough for most people.
Yeah. I'm going on a tangent, but you know, you're here, so I'm going to ask.
Oh no, of course.
A lot of people still debate if 500 series gear is better or worse than rack gear because of the voltage. Mm-hmm. And I think I know the answer. I'm guessing my answer, you know, because you basically just replied a minute ago. It probably depends on what you use to in your modules to make the 500 series module and how to make that voltage work.
Well, for me, the format is really smart because it allows anybody to, if they want to, they can make a module for it. Mm-hmm. In the making the module side, it's a bit complicated because you're limited to a space.
Right.
You're limited to, I have to fit this form factor, I have to fit this configuration. And for some of the companies I've worked with over the years, we've found that it can be limiting. Yeah. If you want to be VPR, which is the API spec, if you want to be VPR compliant, they require that you max draw 110 milliamps of current, which if you're doing Class A circuitry, can be eaten up very, very quickly. Yeah. And then you're kind of like, well, now what? I have a box that, you know. If you meet the specs, you can do some really good things with it if you plan it out. And like everything else in audio, it's all about trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. There's a trade-off from going to a Class A amplifier versus a Class AB amplifier. Yeah. There's trade-offs to Class D amplification that everybody's currently using for power amps. It's really efficient, but there are people who will tell you it doesn't have a sound. Mm-hmm. It's very stale. It's very clinical. Yeah. You're going to get a lot of subjective answers like that over all of this stuff. Yeah. So for me, as a user, it's great. I can fill out a rack however I want. I could do whatever I want. As a designer, and working
it's a bit of a challenge
on design ideas for maybe a 500 design, it's like, well, that's the challenging part. Yeah. Because I have a module that's this wide, that's
this tall. Three racks, yeah.
Yeah, three racks tall. It's not like, oh, it's 19 inches wide. I can put any buttons I want wherever I want. You know?
Well, there are some modules, like 3 of mine are double slot, so you can use double slot. Oh, yeah. Some people do even 3 slots. But I think 2 is like, you know, it starts to be like big.
Well, if you're doing 2 slots, it should be a stereo module. That's
it is.
That's my
opinion. That's the 2 West Audio are all stereo compressor, stereo EQ, Pultec solid state. Yeah. And the Elysia is a feed forward, you know, BCA compressor. But the 2 Neves sound really good, and actually they have like a headroom like for days.
Of course.
So I don't know what they did, how they did it, but they're 2 of my most favorite modules. You know, even considering all this.
Right, of course.
Know? But,
well, you know, and that's why you have different manufacturers who are making different 500 racks.
Yeah.
That they'll tell you, oh, we have a bigger power supply, we can supply more current, into our units and so forth. And there are companies that they have to make their own 500 rack to fit their own modules.
Yeah.
Because it may not work in another rack, even though it's designed to, and theoretically it's supposed to.
I heard some problems, like someone had to adjust a screw or remove a piece of whatever to make it fit. For the most part, they're universal, but there are exceptions for sure.
There's always going to be exceptions.
Yeah.
In theory, it's supposed to be all uniform and universal.
Yeah.
And but the little details sometimes are not as universal as we think they are.
It's probably close to like building a PC. Everything works, but some work better than others, and you might have some problems.
So getting back to your question about your SPL and the 120 volt rails.
Right.
I think they say it better than I do, but I'll just basically come down to, it gives you more headroom and it gives you a cleaner signal. So when you get to the mastering stage of whatever project you're working on, that's probably what you're going to want in a project, unless you're looking for some specific colors and so forth.
Right.
And you'll find that mastering engineers, with the way they work, they have specific devices for different things.
Me too.
And they're very specific. Oh, I only use this when I do this. You know,
or that convert. Like Avi Weinberger, he has that old DSD converter that he uses, like this for that song, for that rock song, has got that.
Yeah, of course.
Great that I like, you know, more better than the super clean high headroom converter.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 120 volt rails, what they're telling you is it's running off plus minus 60 volts. Jesus. So you have your 0 volt line, and you got plus 60 over here, and you got minus 60 over here, which makes 120 volts peak to peak.
Wow. So why nobody else is doing it?
A few different reasons.
Yeah.
Some parts aren't made for it, so you have to make a discrete op amp.
Okay.
And use discrete components.
Yeah.
Going back a bit, it's easy to have an IC chip where everything's in the chip and you just put the chip in.
Okay.
It makes things a lot easier to put stuff together and design. But you're also limited to what the chip performs. Okay. And most chips right now being made are not considered audio friendly. Okay. Because audio is such a tiny market compared to, you know, consumer electronics and cell phones and so forth. So they don't need high voltage rails in your televisions or your, you know, your consumer electronics. Right. To get audio that everybody thinks is okay. Mm-hmm. You know? Yeah, and that's why these things are so expensive. I mean, their build, like the quality of the build, it's amazing, but probably that's why they have to do it custom. For them, they had to do a custom op amp probably. Yeah. And this is just a guess. Because there's very few IC chips that I found that run over 36 volts. Mm-hmm. No, I can tell you, I look it up, they have a custom op amp. Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I can guarantee you they designed a custom op amp. It's probably out of discrete components. Transistors, resistors, capacitors, and so forth to make the operational amplifier. And from there, that allows them to run their 120 volts. Yeah, so it gives you more headroom, and you can drive it for days before it'll distort. You're probably, and this is a guess as well, gonna distort your converters before you distort that. But that's what the question. So if this thing is in between a unit A and unit C, does it really matter if this one has like so much more headroom than the others? Like, where is the advantage if your entire chain is not 120? Well, the advantage is it's still gonna sound cleaner. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Of course, no, absolutely. And I'll tell you flat out that you're only as good as the weakest link in your chain. Exactly. So if the weakest link in your chain is a rack that only runs 30 volts, or is an old equipment that runs 24 volts, you know, that's as high as you get, you know, but it still will sound cleaner. Yeah. And it'll still give you what you need without bringing anything else. Yeah, and especially on a master and EQ. Yeah, no. This is like, you know, a clean, super precise master and EQ, and so that's what you want. Oh yeah. Well, it's like I was looking at a unit the other day for a friend of mine, and at full volume, at output, it's 17 dBu of signal. Isn't that kind of low? I mean, my other units can do like 22, and my Avalon does 31 at full. I'm like, well, 17's not low. 17's good. It'll get you way past 0 VU. Yeah. You won't notice anything in your DAW. And you can run other units like the Avalons where you can get up to 31 dBu before the waveform starts to square off. Does it matter? Of course it does, but I'm asking you, does it matter where in the chain you have it? Let's say you go from A to B to C and then that one. Can you drive it as last unit? So that would be a purpose that you can use the 120. Oh, absolutely. Right? Yeah, you can definitely drive it more before the unit starts to break up and so forth. And you'll notice in power supplies that asymmetrical supplies affect the audio differently. They sound different.
Yeah.
And, you can get certain sonics from an asymmetrical supply versus a bipolar supply, which is the 120, where it's plus 60, minus 60, or plus 18, minus 18. You can get different sonics out of a bipolar supply than you can out of a single-ended supply. Yeah. I've done experiments with certain IC chips that you can drive from a single supply and from a bipolar supply. And depending on the supply and what you're doing with them, they do sound different.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I believe you to say.
And that's the other thing, is you'll get people who will tell you, well, if you can measure it, then you should be able to hear it. But sometimes there's things you can hear you can't measure.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that.
And it's usually because you're measuring the wrong thing.
Yeah, probably, yes. So why is it so hard to build the 120? What would be the things that, like, for example, that's like a question I have, like, is heat a problem?
Heat can be a problem.
Because I imagine in my head, not knowing anything, if like, it's 120, it must be like hot as fuck.
Well, like for example, when you're running Class A circuits, they run warmer than Class AB circuits.
Right.
And they definitely run a lot hotter than Class D circuits, like in your amplifiers and so forth. So yeah, Class A, if it was a Class A circuit running 120 volts, it would get warm. It'd get warm a lot. Heat is kind of an enemy to components.
Yeah.
There's certain consoles that have been around for a long time that are known to get really hot, and when they get really hot, parts start to fail, and when parts start to fail, stuff stops working,
As far as, these things have been around for a long time.
Yeah. Well, the technology's been around for a while now.
Yeah.
Where they're doing the
How long?
In the last 5-6 years is when I first started seeing it.
Okay, I think longer than that, because it's funny because our friend Maor has the old version of this. So that one is probably like 10-12 years old, and it still has the 120. But yeah, I notice it doesn't get that warm.
Right.
For example, the Fusion, you can cook eggs on it.
Yeah.
But this one doesn't. So like, your guess, how can you get around something like this?
Well, like everything else, there's trade-offs, So assuming they're not a Class A circuit, they're Class AB, that'll affect some of it.
Okay.
Other things that affect it, the way you vent the units and where you put your holes and so forth.
Right.
Again, back to the same console manufacturer where components would die very regularly.
Yeah.
The ventilation on it wasn't as good as it should have been, which caused a lot of problems. Yeah. And that was part of it. So there's ways to combat those issues. You just have to take the time to work them out.
Tubes are probably the units that run hotter. Or Class A, would you say?
Oh, definitely tubes, because they have to.
Yeah.
It's the nature of the beast.
Yeah, it's in filament that is in flames, basically.
Yeah. If the filament's not hot enough, your tube doesn't work.
Yeah, of course. Well, anything else you want to add on this?
Oh, I haven't used them yet. I've seen them at the trade shows, and SPL makes good stuff.
Yeah.
You're basically looking at more applicable headroom. Which we all know what headroom is, or at least we should.
Yeah, of course.
Especially by the time you're working in this business with this gear, you should know that stuff.
Absolutely.
So it's basically more applicable headroom, and those are some of the ways to achieve it without any artifacts and any issues and so forth, even in analog land. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, from experience, I've been using this since day one, and it's absolutely amazing. I mean, EQ doesn't sound really like EQ on this thing. It sounds part of the sound.
Yeah, of course.
And you can push it to extreme levels without it sounding like, anything like any other EQ I have. Definitely in everyday use, the 120 volts delivers, I can say, because no other units.
Well, it's a lot of stuff people don't think about, and SPL was smart enough to use it as part of their marketing.
Yeah.
And the design on it's really good. They're really smart. The people at SPL know what they're doing. Yeah,
before getting this, I basically tried and worked with every other EQ on the market. And there are some amazing things, but this can do 90% of what's in the market and then some. Tubes aside, of course, we're talking about solid state. So that was like an easy choice. I think they probably started this with I'm pretty sure they started it with the mastering consoles. The old mastering consoles they used to make. Aui Weinberg has one of them, a couple of other
so
people.
does Bob Ludwig.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was one of the first secrets to start pushing things, right?
Well, that's where they came up with, that's where they did the whole 120, where they started. It was, our console does this, and you heard it at the shows, and you're like, holy shit.
Yeah, exactly.
My knob's full and I don't hear crunch, crunch, crunch. I just hear signal.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. All right, Joe. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for explaining this and other cool stuff as always. And guys, I hope you liked the video. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave a like, comment down below. Joe, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.
Man. Of course.
Bye.
Guys. See you.
Hands on my neck.